Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance further within the Kursk region, leaving only about 83 square kilometers under Ukrainian control, or less than 8% of what they had at their peak. It is only a matter of time before the Russians gain control over the remaining parts of the region, as the Ukrainians have been kicked out of the Sucha area and are only holding on to some border points. The Russians also managed to advance to the north of Chasiv, as well as to the south in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, while the Ukrainians managed to counterattack and regain some positions near Shevchenko in the south of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the Kursk region, the Russians have managed to make significant gains, capturing the remaining suburbs of Sucha, gaining control over the towns of Goncharovka as well as Sauleshensky. The Russians also managed to capture the town of Rubanchina along the main highway towards the border area, regaining full control over the anti-tank ditches and Dragon Teeth west of Sucha. The Russians also managed to flank the town of Sucha from the south through the capture of Melovoy, as well as flanking the border area itself, the border crossing itself near Oleshnia, where the Russians are moving towards the border crossing to regain control over that as well. And with this, the Ukrainians only have about 80 square kilometers remaining under their control, including the Guevo area to the south and the Gogolevka area in the north. Both of these are about equally large, and they're separated into two parts, separated at the middle. So with this, we see that the Russians are currently working to gain control over the border area here near Gogolevka and Oleshnia, to gain control over the remaining two towns along the river line. With this, we see that the Russians only have 4 towns remaining before they regain full control over the Kursk region. We can consider that the Russians already have full control over the Kursk region because the presence of Ukrainian soldiers within the Kursk region is practically non-existent at this point. Whatever forces they had left have withdrawn. There are just a few forces holding up within the towns and the fortified positions, but besides that, the Ukrainian forces have largely retreated and the Kursk offensive has ended. Instead, what we're seeing now is the Kursk withdrawal, and that is in its end phase as well. Therefore, we are likely looking at the final few hours before the Russians regain full control over the Kursk region, potentially longer if the Ukrainians are able to hold up within the fortified positions and forest patches near the Sele River, as it is difficult for the Russians to transport troops and deploy forces here near Guevo and Gorenal. However, the Ukrainians also have a similar difficulty. This means that either the Ukrainian forces have already withdrawn from the area, leaving it as a gray zone, or they will be able to hold on to their positions but have a difficult time withdrawing or supplying their forces, which could end up in a siege taking longer time. In either case, the Kursk Incursion is over for the Ukrainians, and the Russians will regain full control over the border area very soon, and this will lead to further offensive operations by the Russians beyond the border area and into the Sumi region. The Russians will then launch offensive operations not to capture the city of Sumi, but in a similar manner to gain some sort of a bridgehead across the border area and buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border. If we are to take a closer look at such a development, we can see that the main fighting right now by the Russians in the Sumi region is taking place along the Luknia river line in the town of Besivka, as well as in the town of Shuravka in the river line to the west. With these two offensive operations, the Russians are here looking to gain control over both river lines and to advance towards Yunakivka, which will act as their own supply hub for their offensive operations within the Sumi region. And then offensive operations will likely take place within the forest patch area and a buffer zone created between Setki in the southeast and Vasilivka in the northwest. This will allow the Russians to have a buffer area here near Sucha. At the same time, we may see further offensive operations alongside the border area here to the south of Snegust and along the border area where the main roads are able to supply the Russian forces across. As one of the main objectives of the Russians is to create a buffer area that needs to consistently be able to supply their forces for a long period of time. There's also the potential for the Russians to launch offensive operations to the northwest of Sumi to attempt to cut off the supply line between Sumi and the northwestern parts of Ukraine here in the Chernihiv and Sumi border area. This would be able to cut off the supplies between the two sides and create a potential for offensive operations here west of Rilsk in the Kursk and Sumi border area. In either case, it is too much speculation for us to see what will happen. Instead, we can take a look at what will happen in the next few days as the Russians will be entering into the Sumi region. We will see how and where and when. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians have made advance here in Hryhorivka, getting control over another fortified position as they move through the town itself. They're moving now into the forest patches here to the west of the town to gain control of the remaining parts of the canal area and to move further north to gain control over the forest patch area south of Vasilivka for further offensive operations within that town as well. To the south of the city of Pokrovsk, the Ukrainians managed to make some gains here within Shevchenko as they are attempting to encircle the remaining Russian forces within the town. The Ukrainians are here launching a pincer maneuver on the northern and southern flanks of Shevchenko. In the southern flank, they've managed to gain control over the eastern parts of the town, as well as the fortified position along the forest lines, the fortified position in the central parts of the town, and then move on to the southwestern outskirts of the town, as we see with this geolocated footage. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also launching operations on the northern flank to fight over the forest patches and the fortified positions here west of Shevchenko to completely encircle the Russian forces in the central parts of the town. This is due to the hill at the center of the town, which allows the Russians to have some sort of advantage within it. The Ukrainians are having a difficult time gaining control over the remaining parts because there are several stronger buildings such as the school and the post office here in the central parts of the town, which makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to advance with their FPV drones, and Russian ATGM positions prevent the Ukrainians from gaining control of these areas with armored vehicles as well. Instead, the Ukrainians are here making advantage of mobility to flank the Russian positions and attempt to cut off their supplies and then establish their own positions beyond that of Shevchenko to encircle the Russian forces and gain control of the remaining parts of the town that way, as they had failed to directly gain control over the town by storming the Russian forces head on. Therefore, they're bypassing their defenses from the south and from the north. In the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, the Russians have made two advances here to the southwest of Sherbaki and Sherbaki, as they captured several fortified positions of the Ukrainians south of the highway between Oryhiv in the east to Kamyanske and Vasilivka in the west. The Ukrainians are here being pushed back towards the towns, and the Russians are here looking to gain control over the remaining fortified positions ahead of these settlements. It is interesting to see that the Russians continue their offensive operations, although it is at a slow pace. We've seen an increase over the past few days. The Russians managed to regain control over the majority of Pyathatki, and they have also managed to regain some positions south of Kamyanske and now to the south of Sherbaki and Sherbaki, which indicates offensive operations are here larger than I first expected, which could indicate that the Russians are launching some activity here in the southern section of the front line. The question is whether these are probing attacks for larger operations, a diversion, or something else entirely. In either case, the Russians are increasing their offensive operations in the southern section of the front line, and we're seeing more movement by their forces. To go over what we've covered in this video, the Russians are near the completion of their Kursk counteroffensive to regain full control over the region, leaving less than 8% remaining under Ukrainian control. This means that the operation has 92% completion. It is only a matter of days, if not hours, before the Russians regain full control over the Kursk region. In the eastern section of the front line, as well as the southern section of the front line, the Russians have made additional advances, and the Ukrainians launched continuous counterattacks to the south of Pokrovsk. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.